America Foundation. My name is Patrick Doherty. I'm the Deputy Director of the American Strategy Program and the brand new co-director of our Counterterrorism and Counterinsurgency Initiative, here with working with Peter Bergen and Steve Call, who are directing it. And we're just honored here today to talk about civilian casualties in Afghanistan, and specifically CIVIC's new report on how best to address this ongoing, by all accounts, it's currently tragic, and it will continue to be an ongoing tragic issue that we need to deal with more effectively. But let me just kind of bring the room kind of into the frame here that I think is most useful. President Obama, during the campaign, said that the one issue that keeps him up at night was really about focusing on this Afghan-Pakistan frontier and the risk that this insurgency really could aggravate. He's of course talking about the potential destabilization of Pakistan, but it's one complex that we need to be dealing with. He's now named Richard Holbrooke to be his special envoy, and if history is any lesson, Ambassador Holbrooke will be crafting some type of regional deal, a la what he did in the Dayton Accords in the Balkans, what another great special envoy, George Mitchell, did in Northern Ireland. And that will require looking at Afghanistan, Pakistan, India, looking at Kashmir, and expanding this pie and dealing with a much broader regional set of issues to get at some of the underlying forces at play. That's going to take a very long time, and what neither Holbrooke in the Dayton Accords nor Mitchell in the Good Friday Accords had to fend with was something on the order of the Taliban insurgency or Al-Qaeda. And they also didn't have to deal with this issue of scale. And the Afghanistan problem, I just wanted to, we printed it out for you out there, and we just saw my boss come in to share it with our speakers, but we had a great half-page graphic in this Sunday's Washington Post that Peter Bergen and Catherine Tiedemann, Catherine's standing in the back, there she is, were able to get in, just showing really the scale of the challenge and an index, creating an index of the Afghan-Pakistan problem. The problem in Afghanistan is real, that's driving the civilian casualties to a large extent, is numbers. That in Afghanistan, in the Balkans and in Northern Ireland, you had a much better ratio of stability forces to both insurgents and to the local population. And when militaries are outnumbered on the ground, they turn to the air. And when they turn to the air, more often than not, they induce civilian casualties, because bombs, whether they're smart, dumb, or coming off a Predator drone, are indiscriminate once they're launched. Whoever's in their kill zone, they kill. And from the international, multinational side of the forces, this is a large part of the issue, is just the simple fact that they're outnumbered. And that part of the problem here is going to take a long time. The political process is going to take a long time. The military equation is going to take a long time, even if they can get into a situation where they're using the best counterinsurgency methods, where they're protecting the population instead of attacking the enemy. It's going to take a very long time. So I just wanted to bring people into that space. And because it's going to take a long time, we're going to have this problem of civilian casualties for a long time. And what we need to do is get a better handle on how do we address this problem. And the record so far has been pretty grim, is what I'm taking away from CIVIC's work. And that it's uncoordinated, it's underfunded, it's not scaled up, and all of those things have to be improved moving forward. So what we've got today is a great panel, and what I'm just going to do is quickly introduce folks, and then we're going to get right to it. We've got Sarah Holewinski. I'm originally from Buffalo, New York, and there's a pretty large Polish population. So anyways, any luck I had in that, in pronouncing that, it comes from there. Is the executive director of CIVIC, the Campaign for Innocent Victims in Conflict. She was a member of the White House AIDS policy team from 1997 to 2001, and was a former presidential speechwriter. She's been a consultant for Human Rights Watch, with the William J. Clinton Foundation in Rwanda, and has a master's in security policy from Columbia. And then Erica will be, was my understanding, doing the heavy lifting in the interviews on the ground in Afghanistan, and she'll be representing the bulk of the report, and is coming to us from Harvard Law School, where she worked with the Harvard Human Rights Program at Human Rights Watch, and helped provide the research and analysis for the United Nations Committee Against Torture, and for Senator Richard Durbin's judiciary staff. And then after Sarah and Erica kind of present the report, we've asked Eric Schwartz from the Connect US Fund, who's got great experience on the humanitarian side of the ledger. How do we build this into our humanitarian programming, both in his work with Kofi Annan at the UN, with the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights at the UN, but also then in his time at the National Security Council in the Clinton administration, where he worked for many long years trying to figure out this whole concept of complex emergencies, as we called it back then. But now it's taken on a greater insurgency, and we're glad to have Eric to comment on this. So with that, I'm going to sit down and let the experts talk, and welcome you all to the New America Foundation. And I'm looking forward to, after our panel discusses, I think we're going to start with Sarah, then go to Erica, then have Eric make some comments, and then we'll open it up for question and answers. Okay? Thank you, everyone, and looking forward to a great discussion. So, Sarah, if you could come up to the podium, it'd actually be a little easier. We've got this. We've got 2 cameras, and we're live streaming on the web too.
That means I can't make a mistake. Great. I'm going to be very, very brief. I just want to give a context for where this report came from. I think you all know, everyone knows, that civilian suffering in armed conflict is a global, historic problem. But since 2003, CIVIC has been saying to the U.S. military, to international forces, your role in Afghanistan is not just a military mission. There are other things that you have to contend with, one of those being the Afghan population. And the Afghan population expects, and rightly expects, that when harm occurs, naturally, avoid harm as much as you possibly can. When harm occurs to them, deaths, injuries, property damage, apologize, make some sort of amends, help them rebuild their lives. And there are 2 reasons to do that. One is moral. Obviously, the United States, back when we invaded in 2001, and were leading troops in 2003, 2004, before NATO took over, we have a lot of rhetoric about hearts and minds, about humanity, about compassion. When we harm, we also must help, and that's what Afghans see, that's what they expect, that's what we expect of our own armed forces. The second reason is strategic. You don't want to lose the population. What we've been seeing is that the international forces are losing the population 1 civilian casualty at a time. And the new UN numbers that came out today from UNAMA say that. Last year, there were 2,118 civilian deaths in Afghanistan, most of them caused by anti-government forces. But the largest majority of civilians killed were by airstrikes from international forces. So that's something to really take a look at. When we were looking at this issue, we really wanted to do a report like this. We're a very small organization, and Eric Schwartz and the Connect US Fund stepped in last year, and we were able to send Erica Gaston to live in Kabul for a year, and she traveled around. She talked to 143 civilian war victims, and she talked to 80 military, humanitarian, and government officials. And with all of that information, we were able to come up with this report. It's the first report of its kind to closely look at civilian harm, how civilians are suffering in Afghanistan, most importantly, what they expect from international forces when they are harmed. the programs that are available to them when they're harmed, how those programs are helping or, in many cases, not helping them, providing a sense of redress and helping them rebuild their lives. So that is the context for this report, and now I'll step aside and let Erica, who really did do the heavy lifting on this for a year in Afghanistan, through many ups and downs, disappointments, and successes, present these findings. Thanks.
All right, I'm Erica Gaston, and as Sarah said, I've been living in Afghanistan for the last year as a CIVIC fellow, with support both from the U.S. Connect Foundation and from Harvard Law School's Human Rights Program. Thank you all very much for coming today. This has been something I've spent a year talking to, like Sarah said, over 143 civilians that have been affected by conflict. And it's really important to me to be able to bring some of what they told me here to D.C. today and try and share some of their experiences. You know, as Sarah mentioned, there's a UN report out today that talks about a 40% increase in civilian casualties in 2008. There's been a lot of discussion about civilian casualties in general on the news. And of course, altogether, the goal is to prevent civilian casualties from happening at all. But in war, unfortunately, unintended losses do happen. What this report focuses on is what happens after that harm occurs. What happens to Afghan families, and what can we do about it? Okay, and so this is just a quote. This is actually the quote does not go with the person of the picture because the person quoted did not want to be identified. He lives in Kandahar, and his family has been subject to significant airstrikes repeatedly. It's probably a little bit better. It's a bit harder to navigate this. So I just wanted to share this quote because it really, I think, gets across what daily Afghans are saying and how much they're really struggling with the conflict there. There's been a lot of discussion about compensation. Secretary of Gates himself said that we need to do a better job about compensation. The United Nations Special Rapporteur on Extrajudicial Killings, Human Rights Watch, the Afghanistan Human Rights Commission, everyone has talked about civilian compensation. What we're really trying to do in this report is give a bit more context on what's actually happening on the ground and how we can do a better job about it. So first, maybe it's helpful to just give a bit of a context and explain why compensation is important, why we're even having this discussion at all. In 2006, 83% of Afghans said they had a favorable view of U.S. military forces. Now it's dropped 15 points. As Sarah said, there's been a lot of talk about winning hearts and minds, but what does that actually mean on the ground? It means paying attention to what Afghan families are actually struggling with and what they actually need. And for someone that's lost a father, a mother, a son, a child, what they often need and want is someone to just recognize their losses, to provide them help in recovering and getting back on their feet. Sometimes it's just a simple apology. Sometimes it's a small amount of money that can make a big difference in their lives. Each family who suffers losses has the potential to become a catalyst for opposition against international forces. So this is not only a humanitarian imperative, but it's really critical strategically at the point we're in Afghanistan right now. Let's see. When the goals for this report are to show that compensation and victim assistance is already being done in Afghanistan. We don't need to create new programs. We don't need to, create a new wheel, so to speak. We need to just get better about the programs that already exist and make sure that they're fully funded and that they're working well. The second goal of this report is just to kind of give a sense of what civilians think about these issues and what they're actually saying on the ground. And finally, to just offer kind of some concrete steps for going forward. And I think maybe it's important just to call attention to this quote. I'm trying to just go quickly through the presentation. So if I don't read everything that's on the slide, it's in hopes that we can do more question and answer at the end of this. But I do think that this was one of the more kind of touching interviews or statements that I had when I was doing interviews. I was talking to an international aid worker in Kabul, and she was saying to me, compensation is important it's the whole justice system, but showing you're sorry is also important. If you were in the US or Europe and you killed someone's dog, you would say you're sorry. And sadly, that's not what happens when an Afghan's family member is killed in Afghanistan. So first, just to give a brief overview of what I'm going to be talking about for the next 10 minutes or so, we're just going to say, what do families say they need following an incident? What programs exist on the ground by international military, foreign government actors, and the Afghan government? What are some challenges we can just spot right now? And how do they impact feelings of redress and kind of these hearts and mind issues? And then lastly, just some conclusions and some ideas of where to go from here. So a quick methodology, as we said, 143 civilian interviews. We went as many places as we could in Afghanistan, especially given the security conditions. That's not always easy. We went north, south, east, west, all over Kabul. We talked to families that were injured in 2001, and we talked to families that were injured in 2008, because we wanted to get a sense not only of what happens when families immediately suffer a loss, but what happens to them 1 year later, 2 years later, 7 years later if they've still received no help. And we asked them kind of common questions, just what happened to your family? You know, how were you affected? What did you think about international forces? Did you receive help from anyone? Did it change your attitude? So these are kind of the conversations that we had. First, you know, as the UN report today highlighted, the conflict has really escalated in Afghanistan. I think it's been a hot topic here in Washington, D.C. since President Obama began his administration. 3,641 civilians killed in 2007 and 2008. That includes the recent UN figures that were released today. That's a 40% increase in civilian deaths from 2007 to 2008. There are well over 8,000 civilian deaths since 2001. Insecurity has spread from where it was a relatively contained area on the border region with Pakistan in the south to large areas of the south, the southeast, the east, the west, and increasingly in the central and north regions. Many of these areas are now off reach to humanitarians. And what that means for civilians is that when something happens to them, they often have little recourse or little way to get help to pick up their lives again. It's just some common sources of civilian losses. IEDs and suicide attacks are one of the leading causes. 724 civilians in 2008. That's almost the total number killed by international forces. So the largest number is by insurgent forces, but we have to keep in mind as we're going through these numbers that Afghan civilians tend to have higher expectations of international forces than insurgents. A number of them are also being systematically terrorized and targeted by insurgent groups. 552 civilians killed in IMF airstrikes in 2008. Sorry, IMF refers to international military forces. 41 civilians killed in escalation of force incidents. That means at a checkpoint when they're passing a convoy, which is something that happens. An unknown number subjected to night raids or nighttime searches. And then, of course, in Afghanistan, there's still a huge problem with landmines and remaining ERW, or explosive remnants of war. 50 to 60 people are injured or killed by these every month. This is just to give you a sense of some of the people that I talked to and what they were struggling with. Loss of a family member not only means enormous emotional suffering, but it often involves loss of livelihood support. Women and orphans have no way to support themselves, and in Afghanistan, life is hard enough, but when you have no means of support, they're dependent on relatives, on community members, on very few recourse to just meet basic survival needs. They're also often struggling with immediate funeral and medical expenses, and often remarriage costs was something that a lot of Afghan civilians mentioned to us. This man's son was killed in a suicide bombing attack on Bagram Air Base. His son was a translator for the U.S. military. Another huge problem, for every civilian that's killed, an equal or more are injured by the conflict, and that can often be an equal burden for their families. It means huge medical costs, loss of economic opportunity. They face enormous social stigma in getting an education, in finding employment, and just rebuilding a normal life. These two men right here, these are two friends, and both of them are in Western Afghanistan. Both of them, when they were 11 and 12, I believe, were injured in a cluster munition incident. Cluster munitions were used heavily in 2001 by U.S. military forces in the western region. So you can kind of see, I think, by the picture, his legs are permanently deformed. He can't walk. He does not have legs. He also is missing most of his middle section, and he can't use his hands still. So we're talking about really serious injuries to live with. This man, another significant issue is loss of property, loss of home. Sometimes it's not just loss of home, but if you imagine these families that are already struggling, if they lose livestock or farmland, they can't meet the basic survival needs for their family. So a lot of them complained about the problems of property loss. This man right here was caught in an escalation of force incident involving U.S. Marines in March 2007. He was certified by international observers. They found 1,250 bullet holes in his car. So it was quite an escalation of force. But he did receive, actually, compensation from the U.S. military for these losses. And finally, I want to just briefly touch on the refugees and internally displaced persons. This is a growing problem in Afghanistan as the conflict has spread to new areas. 44,000 civilians were displaced in the first half of 2007 alone. And sometimes that means for a week, sometimes it means months, sometimes it means years. This shot is taken from a group of 50 families from Helmand province, one of the most dangerous and conflict-prone provinces in the south, who were living in kind of temporary refugee camps outside of Kabul. Okay, that's kind of our broad strokes view of what civilians are suffering from. I want to go now and just talk briefly about what are some ways that we can help them? Like, what are some of the programs out there that the international military, particularly U.S. forces, who have been really a leader in this type of amends, as well as the Afghan government and other foreign governments? What can we do to help these civilians? So just an overview: international military forces, foreign government actors, Afghan government actors. Many of them have been trying to develop ways to provide amends, to provide recognition or compensation or some sort of assistance for these families. And I'm going to talk a little bit about each of these programs. You know, getting into the finer details is not really necessary, although I do encourage you to read the report that we've put many hours of work into it. But I do just want to give a sense of this because a lot of people say that compensation isn't possible. How do you reach civilians in a conflict? You know, that's not what our priority should be. It's too dangerous. It's not cost effective. It's not what the military or the U.S. government or the Afghan government need to be focused on. And so what I want to do in just providing this section is just give a sense that actually it is possible. It's not that hard. It is working on the ground. We do have some issues, some serious issues in trying to get these programs implemented. But the programs that are working on the ground are developing solutions for getting around these hurdles. So I'm just going to briefly go through each of these sections and just give you a sense of what different types of aid and compensation are available to families. So first, international military forces. A lot of civilians told us that when an incident happened, they got immediate medical assistance from international military. They said, you know, international military forces came in with helicopters. They brought us to medical bases. They gave us treatment we couldn't have gotten in any other Afghan hospital. So a lot of them were very appreciative about this type of assistance. There are a few programs that do kind of broader community support. I'm not going to touch on those very much, but it's just important to recognize because a lot of international military did want to note these and say that they were important. When we were interviewing and say, you know, we also go out and we build schools for families and we provide immediate assistance when humanitarians can't get there. And so that's important just to note. And perhaps more interesting for our discussion and for larger kind of strategic discussions about hearts and minds are the compensation and ex gratia payments. There's no common ISAF policy on compensation or ex gratia, ISAF being the International Security Assistance Force, which is the umbrella name for the NATO alliance there. But most ISAF member countries do have some form of compensation or ex gratia. Now first, what is this ex gratia? What's the term I'm using here? Formal compensation implies liability, and it's pretty rare that that actually is something that Afghan civilians get. Ex gratia is a term of art that de facto it kind of is compensation, but it's not legally binding. It's an out-of-kindness payment for them to just give civilians, say, $2,000, we're extremely sorry for your suffering. It doesn't imply an assumption of liability. The ex gratia payments, for that reason, are far more common than the formal compensation payments. As I said, they're non-binding legally. There's no standard amount because there's no ISAF common policy. It varies with each country. You know, a standard amount, we've often heard of countries saying we give $1,000 to $2,000 for a death, but we've heard as high as $5,000. We've heard as high as a family receiving $20,000 for the loss of 3 family members. So it really does vary significantly. And we've also heard of one country whose troops didn't have formal funds. A civilian was killed and injured in a suicide bombing, rather. And they just scraped together out of their own pocket money $300. So it can vary a lot in terms of the amount that's actually given. And they also do sometimes give money for property losses. That's often a bit more flexible. They often have a bit more discretion on the ground to give money for property loss because there's less concerns about liability. And that can also vary from $100 to, $2,000 is probably one among the highest. Let's see. Another major program that's helping Afghan civilians in Afghanistan is the Afghan Civilian Assistance Program. Now, this program was first funded by Congress in 2006. USAID oversees it, and it's currently implemented on the ground by the International Organization for Migration. It covers all losses that civilians suffer by international military forces. It also covers those that suffer due to indirect effects of international forces. So like a suicide bombing attack on international military forces, the civilian victims would receive assistance from this program. Or say there was a truck driver for a U.S. military supply convoy, he would also receive assistance. It's really kind of a tailored in-kind assistance package. It depends on the family. Often what they'll do is they'll go to a family and say, what do you need to rebuild and get back on your feet? There's no direct money given. It's either to help them start a business or give them medical assistance or to provide vocational literacy training. Sometimes it's even just providing them the actual materials to rebuild a house. So it varies a lot for each family. It also occasionally provides community projects. This is used particularly if there are security conditions that won't allow them to get to each individual family. So for example, if there's a community that suffered from airstrikes in 2002 and it's been cut off because it's in a Taliban-controlled area, what they might do, because it's still dangerous to get in there and help every one of the 20 families that was injured, is they'll set up a community project to build like a retaining wall or some larger support that gives cash for work payments and also helps the overall community rebuild. This was we actually drew a lot of interviews from this program because it was, sorry, we're wrapping up on time, so I'll try and go really quickly. We have a lot of wonderful stories from this program. Civilians were really appreciated. It really helped their lives. So I really encourage you to look more into that. I'm just going to skip quickly because we've only got about 5 more minutes and just briefly overview. The final category is the Afghan government does have funds. One of the Afghan ministries, the Ministry of Labor, Social Affairs, Martyrs, and Disabled, provides a stipend. It's about $10 a month. Unfortunately, this program had a lot of problems in implementation, and we only found one guy of our 143 interviews, this is him, who received this, but he was very happy about it, and hopefully the program is undergoing a lot of changes and it will work better in the future. The other one that did actually reach a lot of families was President Karzai's fund. It pays about the same amount as the U.S. ex gratia payment system. It pays about $2,000. And particularly for a lot of the big airstrikes that happened in 2008 that I'm sure you read about in the news, they got in there with a week and gave every family something. So this one actually was really working on the ground pretty well. Okay, just really quick, we'll go through a couple challenges. Just to give you a brief overview, I've just thrown a bunch of programs at you quickly, but to give you a sense if a family was actually affected, what could they expect? Maybe they get immediate medical assistance from the international military. Immediately afterwards, in a week, they could get ex gratia funds from the U.S. military or other military involved. or they could get money from President Karzai's fund, about $2,000. They could expect in a few weeks after that to a couple of months, depending on security, follow-up assistance from the ACAP program that Congress funds. They could also get some of the broader community support I mentioned, and they might, if they became eligible, receive the $10 monthly payments from the Martyrs and Disabled Fund. So that sounds like a pretty good package. You know, it seems to cover everything: medical assistance, immediate money, community support, rebuilding. The problem in Afghanistan has been due to a lot of problems with coordination and accessibility. This is what the average Afghan must go through. And I'm sure a lot of you are looking at this going, what, this is a crazy slide, it doesn't make sense. If you don't understand it, imagine what an Afghan who's suffering the loss of a family member has to do. When I have families approach me and say, my daughter was killed, I've lost my home, I need someone to help me, trying to get them to navigate through this system, you can see there's a lot of dead ends. They have to be, a lot of times it has to be a perfect combination of circumstances, identified immediately. The troops that were identified are reachable, and they know which troops did it, because often if it's an airstrike or if it was caused by special forces who aren't based there, they have no way of finding out who was responsible. The troops that are identified have funds and discretion. Not all troops in Afghanistan have ex gratia funds. The U.S. is among the best in terms of providing these funds, but many of the smaller countries don't, and there's no ISAF common fund that provides it. You know, in terms of some of the other programs, like if there was media or independent monitors that were available and they can record it, there's a good chance maybe they'll get something from the President Karzai's fund, from ACAP, from Martyrs and Disabled. But if it's in an insecure area where there's often not media coverage or their independent monitors or humanitarians can't get there, their case might just not have been documented, and they may have no way to establish that they deserve this help. Finally, one quick thing, and then I'll just jump quickly to conclusions, is the idea of redress. And I just want to give a sense of what this is because it's important for the larger hearts and minds discussions. One thing that we wanted to find out is not only what helps families recover physically, medical expenses, livelihood expenses, economic support, but what do they feel like they actually need to move on, and what changes their perceptions of international military in terms of these hearts and minds concerns. So first, I think we'll just, for time purposes, we'll go on. First, you know, there's no one way to give across the sense of emotional resolution or redress. Many civilians said, we just wanted an apology. We wanted someone to recognize that this happened to our family. Afghans tend to look at public media denials that an airstrike happened or that any civilian casualties were incurred, and for them it's an incredible offense towards their lost family members. So a lot of them asked for apologies. They asked for some sort of gesture or recognition. Some wanted a formal trial and justice, and those civilians were the hardest to satisfy for obvious reasons. But we did find in many of our interviews that apologies were important and that civilians did feel a sense, more of a sense of redress, more of a sense of closure, less bitterness, less resentment towards international troops when a representative of international military forces came to their community or came to them personally and said, we're sorry, that wasn't our intention. You know, we recognize the suffering that this has caused for your family, and we'd like to provide something that will help you out. I'm just going to skip ahead because we're short on time. What I've tried to give a sense to in this lightning version of our report, which I hope you'll get to peruse in a bit more depth, is that compensation and support to victims is possible, and it's practical on the ground. Compensation and apologies are expected in Afghanistan. They're standard within the culture. They ask for them whenever an incident happens, and we have the means to provide that in Afghanistan in most of the situations we're dealing with. I've tried to give you a sense that there are some problems still with lack of coordination, with needing troops or programs to be a bit more proactive in going to families, in finding them and in helping them with their losses. We need to be better about responding immediately and recognizing losses. We need to make sure that our priority for whether out of strategic hearts and minds concerns or out of humanitarian concerns, that those are placed above liability concerns about admitting that civilian casualties happened. And we need to make sure, lastly, that all of the mechanisms I've talked about are fully supported in terms of funding and also in terms of resources on the ground to operate in Afghanistan. Let's see. So I think we have a bunch more recommendations that are in the report, and they're also in the executive summary, if you want to read the short, abbreviated version of it. And I encourage you to look at all of them. Like I said, we need to improve coordination, ensure adequate funding, and develop mechanisms that track civilian casualties and the making of amends. And I hope that that gave you a broad overview and that you be able to bring out some more of this material in questions and answers.
Thank you, Eric. This is great. Very impressive. I'm hoping everyone gets the opportunity to take a look at the actual document. Now we'll ask Eric Schwartz to come up. Eric, of course, from the Connect US Fund. We're looking forward to your comments.
Thank you. I don't know how much I really have to add. I guess I'll just throw out a few thoughts in no particular order. One, before I make any comments, I guess the question that emerges from my mind from Erica's presentation, I'm going to talk for about 10 minutes? Is it? Okay. Is the glass half full or is it half empty? And I think when we get to the questions and answers, I think that's one thing I'd really be interested in hearing Erica comment about, because the one sense I didn't get from the presentation is an answer to that question. I mean, there's certainly some encouraging elements, but but I think that's kind of a key issue. You also get the sense that a real sense that we're both the international community is both trying to fly the plane and build the plane at the same time, which is in this area of victims' compensation, which increases the challenge, but also I think reflects how important it is to be able to do both. I also think it's probably worthwhile to step back and say that, there's an kind of step back and look at the big issue here that's at play. That there is an understanding and an appreciation of the importance of protection of civilians in international humanitarian law. The Geneva Conventions are long and detailed. The Fourth Geneva Convention, I checked this morning, has 159 articles about the importance of protection of civilians. The principal admonition is that persons taking no part in hostilities shall in all circumstances be treated humanely without any adverse distinction founded on race, color, religion, or faith, sex, birth, or wealth, or any other similar criteria. And international law recognizes that in the conduct of warfare, it's never the case that all bets are off, that a legitimate military target is one which, by its nature, location, purpose, or use, makes an effective contribution to military action and whose total or partial destruction, capture, or neutralization offers a definite military advantage. Now, I'm not as much an expert on international law as some others, but rules like that also come with certain expectations and reflected in a number of legal instruments that suggest redress for victims. The fascinating thing about Erica's presentation is that all that is well and good, but is kind of irrelevant for most of the circumstances that Erica is writing about in her report. To me, that's the real fascinating element of the presentation, that everything I've just laid out is critically important, but probably doesn't factor into these circumstances. Because these are cases where, in some cases, the military could credibly say they took appropriate precautions and that civilians were the unintended victims, but the precautions were adequate. And even in those circumstances where you could question that, militaries aren't inclined to go down that path. They will take the position that that protections were adequate. And in fact, if you think about it, if you really think about it, the issue is kind of complicated. When you're in this area of civilian victims who are the unintended victims, and in circumstances where militaries presumably took appropriate precautions. The issue is complicated if you think about it a little bit, because, take the U.S. Intervention in Afghanistan after 9/11, and if civilians were if the military took appropriate precautions and civilians were harmed on a kind of a moral basis, who really is responsible for those civilian damages? Is it the U.S. military, or is it the Taliban, or is it al-Qaeda? I mean, it's interesting philosophical questions, but probably I think another point that Erica makes is those philosophical questions are irrelevant in many respects, because the bottom line is there is suffering which the Taliban and al-Qaeda are not going to respond to, and people are in need. And a smart policy suggests that our military be responsive and responsible. And I think there are some encouraging signs. Erica mentioned Secretary Gates' statement. What he said at this hearing was, I've taken a lot of time with this issue myself. It was the primary subject of my conversations with both President Karzai and with General McKiernan and his staff when I last visited Kabul. He's talking about civilian casualties. I think we have, particularly in terms of how we respond when there are civilian casualties, I think we've been too bureaucratic about it. Our approach has been, in a way, classically American, which is let's find out all the facts and then we'll decide what to do. But in the meantime, we have lost the strategic communications war. Well, it sounds to me like he kind of gets it, and that's very encouraging. He went on to say, and so the guidance that I provided is that our first step should be, quote, if civilian casualties were incurred in this operation, we deeply regret it, and you have our apologies. And if appropriate, we will make amends. Then we will go investigate, and then we will figure out whether we need to do more, or, frankly, if we paid somebody we shouldn't have, frankly, I think that's an acceptable cost. But we need to get the balance right in terms of how we interact with the Afghan people, or we will lose. So he clearly gets your message, or at least his words suggest that he clearly gets your message. And I think that's very encouraging. So going back to flying the plane and building the plane, in terms of building the plane, he said, and if appropriate, we will make amends. So the first policy question is, what is appropriate? What does he mean by that? And what do we mean by that? And what is our level of obligation? Is it a moral obligation? Do we want it to be a legal obligation? I think there'd be a lot of concern about that in terms of the likelihood of moving forward programmatically if people start to talk about legal obligations. That's not necessarily a reason not to, but I think it's something that has to be considered. And then once we determine what guidelines or norms or policies should structure this effort, how is it implemented more effectively? Our government has to get its head around these issues. What are best practices for us? What are best practices that we want to encourage others? And then how do those best practices get gelled into guidance? And how firm does that guidance become? And are we talking about a new normative framework, or is that something we want to shy away from? I think those are really important policy questions which should not deter or slow the effort to fly the plane, to continue with these compensation payments. But part of me feels that we ignore these questions probably over time at our peril. So I think you probably have to do both. The government probably has to do both. And there are lots of questions. And let me just finish up. I'm still well within my 10 minutes with some of the questions that I think are raised by this. The first, how much energy do you spend on the ground on bothering to determine whether there have been violations of the laws of war? Are there standards for what an apology should look like, what the nature of an apology should be, and what the nature of compensation should be? The report made an interesting observation that, and correct me if I'm wrong, but that certain forms of compensation, monetary compensation, is perceived as a compensation and an apology. But other forms of aid really aren't perceived in that way. They may be welcomed, they may be useful, but they're not seen in the same dynamic. And I think that's interesting and kind of made sense to me, too, when I read it. The roles between the civilian parts of the government and the military in this area. It seems to me that certain activities are probably much more appropriate for civilians. At the same time, I think there is a perceptual and a moral advantage in seeing that the agent of the damage is also the agent of the compensation. And so how do you manage that issue? You know, so these are all questions that I think need some very serious and disciplined thought within the government, which is why I was particularly taken by one recommendation that there be a czar in the Department of Defense to kind of help the government get its head around this issue. But again, I think my final point is that none of these, you know, kind of step back in policy issues should take place at the expense of the efforts that are on the ground now, as some of which seem to be playing a very important role.
Great, thank you, Eric. This was incredibly enlightening. What I want to do is just open it up for a quick question for myself, and then open it up to you guys. My question is, just to kind of go even beyond the scope of the report, and thinking about what the United States government did after World War II, and then what, in a strange kind of leap of analogy, Hamas and Hezbollah have been able to do in their respective territories in Gaza and southern Lebanon, essentially providing, is there an opportunity here to go beyond just providing the victims of international force violence and aggression? Is it possible to go, is there an offensive opportunity here in terms of that strategic communication battle that Eric was mentioning? And to start to see, can the United States government, can the allies start compensating victims of insurgent violence? Is there another opportunity here to get on to go beyond it? And there's a lot to discuss just in the meat of the report, and I'd love for you to take a first crack at this, and we'll open it up real quick. But do we need to also think that way to go on the offensive on this, not just to kind of get back to the point of making sure that we're compensating justly for the damages that we have done, but is there an offensive opportunity here? And any of the three of you wanted to, Eric, if you wanted to take a shot.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think there is an opportunity. I think one of the,
Bring the microphone over.
maybe one of the outstanding issues in Afghanistan is that making sure that all civilians receive adequate and equal compensation, that it doesn't matter if you were killed by the Taliban or your family member was killed by a U.S. troop or a Romanian troop, that everyone deserves a chance at receiving some sort of assistance and getting back on their feet. So in that sense, I think it is important to recognize and to think about this issue. A lot of policymakers and a lot of military actors in Afghanistan are reluctant because they see it as a way to draw a distinction between international forces and the Taliban. But I think you're right that I'm not sure the average Afghan picks up on that distinction. I think
It's
they
not their
either
fight,
see an
so,
expression
right.
of help from international forces or they don't. And I think that in almost any situation of fighting or airstrike, they lay blame on equal side. It doesn't matter which bullet got them. So,
Great, thanks. Anyone else?
One quick anecdote, when I was in Afghanistan in 2006, I talked with some families who were harmed in 2001, and it's important to remember that while the Taliban is now using terror tactics, suicide bombings, and using civilians as human shields, back in 2001, they saw this as a war of perception. And their part in the war of perception was to do exactly what Patrick just mentioned, which is to go on the offensive. And I heard stories from civilians who were unintentionally harmed by U.S. airstrikes, and then the Taliban came in, gave them food, money, cloth to wrap their dead. The Taliban knew what they were doing, and they went on the offensive. Now they've shifted tactics and are terrorizing civilians, but they saw that as a war of perception.
Interesting, interesting. Eric, did you want to comment on that, or we'll just?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's, I think it's a no-brainer. I think the answer to your question is yes. I think the challenge would be to push it through the...
It's an interagency nightmare.
Yeah, I mean, but it's a classic example of why, I mean, I don't want to waste any more breath. I mean, I think it's a no-brainer.
Yeah, great. Okay, we're going to open it up. Thanks for indulging me here. And who would like to take the first question? The lady in the middle.
I have a question about...
And there's a microphone coming your way. And if you could identify yourself.
Mina
as well.
Ahmed.
Thank you.
I have a question about access. A lot of the civilian airstrikes are in the most dangerous areas, obviously. I mean, not civilian airstrikes, but the airstrikes that harm civilians. And these are the areas that you guys don't have that much access to on the ground. So how are you compensating the places that are most affected and, you know, winning? I mean, it's very difficult to win hearts and minds down in those areas. And you all know, as I do from having been there, that the Taliban now controls, you know, close to 50%.
No, I think you're right. I think this is one of the biggest challenges. One of the things I wish we'd been able to get more into is kind of how you address some of these access issues that you're talking about. It is one of the most difficult to provide compensation or assistance in these areas. The ways that most of the programs or military actors have gotten around it was trying to work either through intermediaries, which in itself, like local leaders, which in itself introduces some other issues of corruption and things like that. And another way they've done it is make some of the aid accessible in city centers that civilians can travel to, doing things like providing compensation through blind bank transfers, for example, so that even the Taliban isn't aware, and they'll do it in incremental amounts so that no one has a huge amount of cash in order to protect the civilians themselves from being targeted by the Taliban in kind of a retaliation strike. But you're right that it's a huge problem and it doesn't work all the time in some of these areas. And especially when you're talking about civilians who are isolated in these areas and really can't afford or can't get out to the city centers or to some sort of access. I think that's where you've got the biggest challenges, and they need to find a bit better ways to do that. And then really quickly, just on your other point about hearts and minds in these areas, I think you're right also that it is harder to have the sort of redress or hearts and minds impact in these areas. It's certainly true that it's important to provide recognition and an apology, but it's true that civilians will accept the apology the first, the second, the third, and the fourth time. But in a repeat area, there is a level where it will start to have a reduced impact. I mean, I think that's where we need to keep in mind kind of both goals of reducing civilian casualties, but also providing help where we have harmed. So.
Okay, another question? No, sir.
Jason Campbell with the Brookings Institution. Have a question regarding, you know, in some of the airstrikes that you refer to, U.S. ISAF, that do claim civilian casualties. It seems to be an obvious pattern where there's an initial report of the number of civilians killed and wounded, followed by some conflicting reports, usually from either the government or U.S. ISAF representatives that are much lower. And I was wondering, I'd be interested in getting your perspective on the average Afghan. How discriminating are they in the reporting that goes on? Is it really a matter of what gets reported first is what they believe, or is there sort of a general sense that there may be some other truths going on?
In terms of what numbers they believe, like whose version of the story, or?
Right.
I think they generally believe the Afghan version of the story, and sometimes after that the international community, and last the international military. So I'm not sure it's necessarily the timing as much as the person that it's coming from, especially at this point, since there have been several instances where international forces denied civilian casualties and then backtracked. I think that's led to a level of mistrust about whether the international military is providing an accurate. I mean, I think that international forces are getting better and they've started to recognize this, but because of past issues with this, there's just a lot of distrust among the Afghan population.
Okay. Back there, sir.
David Ritkers. I'm with
There we
the
go.
Cato Institute. My background is as a Special Forces officer in Afghanistan at the border. And in my 3 tours, I actually saw the development of this problem. And just both a comment and a question, in many of these instances, people are following the laws of war and all the guidelines correctly. But with a couple of incidents, there became a narrative was created where the military was slow to put out its side of the story, often a good news story, when they were trying to discriminate and expose themselves to additional fire to sort out, who was an insurgent and who was not. And I think my perception of the problem is that it's become this narrative that the Taliban and Al-Qaeda can easily add another rift to every time something happens, and that they seem to be beating us to the punch. And as you mentioned, the chronology that they get their reports out first. In your year overseas, did you see an effort by the military leadership there to, every time we drop a bomb, we drop a press release, and to get out in front of the propaganda cycle? Thank you.
Yeah, I think that they are actually trying to be much more responsive. I mean, you're right, it is an issue of timing. I have friends that are working with different press organizations in Kabul, and they'll say the first call that they get after an incident is from the Taliban spokesperson. I mean, they're there and they're on it and they have their line. So you're right, it is an issue of timing. I think that international forces are trying to be more responsive and get out their side of the story and explain why they chose that area, or what their perception is on whether laws of war or other issues. Unfortunately, the first attempts at this tended to be there are no civilian casualties, was always kind of a knee-jerk reaction. And I think that now they've actually learned that where that's not the case, although it is often the case, but where that's not the case, it creates so much backlash that it's not worth it. It has huge strategic communications costs. But they're starting to get a little bit better about saying, no, actually, if something happens, we need to admit it up front and try and be responsive and still get our side out. So it's been a trial and error process, but I think they're getting a bit better about it.
I've got a question, actually, for Erica on this. I mean, the question that was embedded, I think, in your comment is, critics of expanding programs of compensation might argue that if you do that, you help create a perception among the Afghan people that of kind of an admission of responsibility for violations of the laws of war. And it would be helpful to get your perspective on that, whether Afghans view compensation as some sort of kind of admission of guilt for taking action that should not have been taken.
I think that's an important point, and I think that's kind of in the back of a lot of the minds of a lot of forces that are there. But I think, and probably as Mr. Vickers could attest, a lot of the incidents of compensation that go on aren't at a high level. Most of them are someone isn't harmed, sometimes not even by the forces themselves, through a suicide attack by insurgents. And troops at the base actually care and just say, let's see what we can do. Let's see if we can find money, and let's see if we can help them. And that's the overwhelming majority of the cases. Now, the others that get a bit more media attention, that are higher profile, the large airstrikes, I think you could argue that in those cases, the media spotlight is already on the civilian casualties. So the best that you can do is just show that you're trying to help.
Great. Sir.
John Stinner, Asia Foundation. Because corruption is as big a problem as it is in Afghanistan, I was wondering, have you seen much corruption in existing programs, and how do you perceive, how do you see the stepping around corruption in any programs that could be instituted in the future?
I think you're exactly right. This is a huge problem across the board in Afghanistan, and it's no exception with compensation and victim assistance. One of the problems is that one of the other audience members raised the issue of security and getting to communities that are hardest hit. And one of the ways to do that is to try and go through local officials. But of course that doesn't help when the local officials, are themselves corrupt or trying to get a particular sum for their tribes. You end up creating sometimes more problems than were intended. A couple of the Afghan programs in particular have had issues with corruption in the past. One of the programs I mentioned that hadn't had much reach, that had only been received by one Afghan that we interviewed, part of the reason was that those to become eligible, they had to be certified by the Afghan judiciary, which has a lot of corruption problems. So I do think it's really present. A couple of the programs have gotten around this. the Afghan Civilian Assistance Program, the one that's funded by Congress, it has a lot of their own staff doing the identification and their own kind of local intermediaries. And I think through that way they get around some of these problems. I talked to a couple of the Afghan ministries, and they said that what they've actually started to try and do is, particularly for the Karzai program, is they've tried to try and like check it through multiple different government offices that don't necessarily know that they're checking on each other. And I think they'll still have some issues with that, but what they're just trying to do is have different sources of verification, or say, hey, they said 30 civilians were injured, ask a different person in a totally different program, ask the NGO worker, ask the journalist, and see if you can get the best approximation so that you're not getting inflated numbers or issues of corruption.
Great. Gentleman back there, yeah, in the yellow.
My name is Philip Smucker. I wrote a book on Al-Qaeda, Al-Qaeda's Great Escape, mainly about Tora Bora. The battle there, of course, had a lot of civilian casualties, and that started what we've seen as a pattern where there's been an over-reliance on air power. And I wondered, Erica, if you, in your investigations, if you can come to any generalizations on the overuse of air power. It concerns me. I go back to Afghanistan quite a bit. The guy that worked with me at Tora Bora and helped me write my book is now the governor of Laghman province. And in January, early this year, they had a huge incident where 26 civilians were killed, and he's very pro-American. He called a spade a spade. He said these civilians were killed, and the U.S. military was still denying that. So despite what Gates says, I think on the ground we have not seen a great change, and if you could comment on that as well, thank you.
Just a quick point, I think Sarah also wants to comment on it, but actually in the Laghman province incident, they did go in just recently, I think about 2 weeks after the incident, and they did admit that there were civilian casualties and provide compensation. So actually I think that's one case where they've noticed and they're starting to try and do a better job. There are definitely some cases that aren't such a strong example, and the critique is very valid, but I think that actually was one where they did try and make an improvement, and they did make a positive change.
Just a brief comment. U.S. officials have recently come out and said that they're not going to use airstrikes anymore. They're going to let insurgents get away. It sounds like great news when it comes to civilian casualties, but there's another side of that. I mean, every strategy that you change, there's an upside, there's the benefit of why they're doing it. There's also a downside for civilians. When you stop airstrikes, the Taliban know that they can then go and hide out in civilian homes, in schools, as they're already doing, but more so because they know that the U.S. is not going to then hit those places. So when it comes to the U.S. military strategy in Afghanistan, I think obviously we want to avoid civilian casualties as much as possible because it is upsetting the local population and we don't want to cause harm. But every strategy needs to be looked at from that benefit, but also what are the ramifications that are going to happen for civilians.
Okay. Right in the back next to the camera. Yeah.
Tiritza Leibowitz from Survivor Corps. I want to ask a question from the other side of Mr. Schwartz's question. You had asked about whether the payment of the making of amends is perceived as acknowledgement of responsibility, and I'm interested to know whether you faced the opposite kind of criticism, whereby this money serves, to say it bluntly, as blood money. So without looking, for example, at the use of airstrike at human cost, it's, go kill and pay. Have you faced such criticism either from inside, from the people in Afghanistan, or international criticism?
I think maybe more in Afghanistan, it's maybe a special context. I think there's different ways that compensation or assistance works well for victims of conflict in different contexts. Within Afghanistan, there is a history of providing compensation and payments and apologies. It's been a part of the traditional judicial system, the non-formal judicial system for a long period of time. And so I actually haven't heard that from Afghan civilians. Traditionally, most of them say they didn't give any help, they didn't give any compensation, they didn't even apologize. The closest that it's come is that some families will say, they only gave me $1,000, like that's not enough, that's laughing at my misery. But I think that was more a question of they didn't think that amount was high enough, not that they were insulted to be given money at all, so to speak.
Okay, the gentleman in the front row here.
Patrick Duplat from Refugees International. A lot of NGOs criticize the military in Afghanistan for providing relief and blurring the lines, and I guess some of these compensation mechanisms involve more than just an apology and disbursement of money, but actually, as you mentioned, building of schools or working with the community or the families that are affected. And I'm just wondering how far the military can go, and are NGOs, I think, wary of the military providing even more assistance than they are doing today.
Yeah, where is the line between what's appropriate for the military to give and the rest of the international community?
Yeah, I'm really glad you raised this point because I really wish we'd have gotten it. It's in the report, but I wish we had gotten to touch on it a bit more in discussion. This is actually a really contentious point among humanitarians in Afghanistan. A lot of them are really sensitive and feel that the provincial reconstruction teams that are providing this community support have gone too far, that their concern is that in building schools, in building all of these community support, what they've done is they've undermined the humanitarian space and they've put communities at risk. That's a really serious concern that a lot of humanitarians have. There's actually been less concern that compensation itself blurs this line. In fact, the agency coordinating body on Afghan relief, which is kind of the umbrella organization for all humanitarian relief organizations operating in Afghanistan, has come out calling for compensation and apologies. So that kind of niche itself of military harm is relatively uncontroversial among the community, but you're certainly right that a lot of the other community support, it's questionable whether that is kind of blurring that line. And additionally, one of the interesting findings that we had in our report was that civilians very rarely mention this to us. Like when we ask questions about what helped you, what changed your impressions of the international community, no one mentioned, oh, they built a school down the street, oh, they provided emergency relief. So I think, not only does it have this questionable blurring of line of humanitarian relief, but we need to look a bit closer and see, does it actually have the hearts and minds value that we're arguing that it has? Like, is it both causing harm and not doing that much good on these sort of strategic perceptional questions? So.
As well as being an extra operational burden to these military forces, yeah. Okay, right here in the corner.
Josh Weisberg from the Aspen Institute. How have public perceptions changed since 2001 as the Taliban has changed its tactics as compared to, say, Hamas or Hezbollah? And have they made a strategic choice to stop making as many of these payments? Or and how do the public perceive that?
You mean the payments, the Taliban that Sarah was speaking about earlier in 2001, or?
Payments for the deaths that they, that
okay.
they're responsible for.
Mostly, actually, there's been very few instances that we've heard of Taliban payments. There were a few around 2001, 2002, particularly in 2001, where they were still arguably in control as the government in those areas. You did hear about going to families providing immediate food and non-food aid. I did have one Afghan official say he heard about one province in Kandahar where a group of Taliban were still paying about the same, about the $2,000 amount for those that were harmed, but it was really only one or two isolated incidents. We don't hear about it virtually at all, which suggests that if it's happening, it's not widespread or happening a lot. So in terms of that, I'm not sure it's easy to say how public perceptions have been affected by that. I mean, public perceptions have definitely changed as there's been more direct targeting and kind of terrorizing the population, firing from the middle of communities and civilian populations.
Do they make payments for when the international military forces, as they do, as Hamas does in Gaza, make payments? When Israel
right. I mean, honestly, there's been so few and no confirmed cases of them actually making payments. I'm sure that some of them do happen. I'm sure on a minimal, but there's just not enough of them happening to say that it's happening, that they have a rationale that they're giving it for international forces or their own or whoever. So.
Interesting. Okay, any other questions? Right here in the corner.
You said that these...
if you could identify yourself.
Sorry, my name is Ali Agreeb. I'm with Interpress Service. You said that these legally binding compensations were rare, but when they have happened, what have been the legal consequences for either the international military forces or otherwise? And if you could just expand a little bit more on the difference between the ex gratia compensation than the legally binding ones? Thank you.
Right, there's only a few of these. There's, through the U.S. Foreign Claims Act, they can make a claim through U.S. courts. Foreign citizens can make a claim, but it's only for non-combat harm, and what is combat and non-combat harm has been defined very narrowly. So even things that you say are not direct combat, like a boy is walking past a checkpoint and is shot, that's often considered combat harm, and therefore it's excluded from this. That compensation can provide up to $100,000. There's the ACLU went through a thorough review they did a Freedom of Information Act request on this, and so they have a bit more information on the different cases. But most of what you think of as are actually unintended harm in Afghanistan are not eligible under this. And so I think that kind of answers the liability question, because anything that you would consider a civilian casualty is pretty much not eligible under this. So maybe that answers that a little bit. And then the only other program that we've heard about of formal compensation is there was a case going through the British courts where there was an Iraqi boy who was paralyzed due to a negligent discharge. And he was given, I think it was £2 million. But the MOD came out saying this is a rare case, it's not going to happen again, it's just a one-time thing. But he did actually have, I think, human rights lawyers in the UK who brought the case up through the British courts on his behalf. So it's very, very rare when it does happen.
If I could just follow up on one of these kind of what I'm seeing as one of the key points is kind of how the military itself is viewing its own role in compensations, because it looks like there's at least here at this table, we're pretty much saying there's a consensus that the military has to do kind of at least that initial compensation to kind of really manage that relationship most appropriately. But at the same time, we've got that there's a real countervailing force on the military not to report, civilian casualties, mistakes. To what extent is the chain of command viewing civilian casualties as a mistake and something to minimize in terms of reporting, as if they had stats on which they were being judged, or as something that, hey, this is, to be blunt, the cost of doing business, and this stuff is going to happen. Civilian casualties are going to happen, and we need to get out ahead of it and deal with it in a very effective way. And I'd open that question up to the panel, but also to Mr. Vickers in the back, who had the actual experience of being on the front lines, in the middle of a chain of command, and kind of knows what he was kind of at least privy to on the ground there. So ask the panel first, and then Mr. Vickers, if you wanted to comment, it'd be great to hear your thoughts.
I mean, I found just on the ground, I can't tell what the discussions are here in D.C. among the military leadership. But I found, at least in Afghanistan, when I go and talk to troops or when I talk to military leaders, they tend to get it, particularly the troops that are actually in the base. Like, if they actually see harm and they think that it was just a civilian, and most of them feel like that's not what I'm here to do, that's not intentional. And if they can find a way to help, they usually try to. So I actually didn't find that was where the resistance was. And even in headquarters level, I think they're a bit more sensitive because they do have to deal with sort of these civilian casualty numbers more often. A lot of them considered, this is the cost of war and we do want to win. They had kind of these hearts and minds strategic concerns. Mm-hmm. Where I got the most resistance actually was visiting like embassies, and perhaps not surprisingly because they do have to deal with the liability officials, but it was the government agencies and officials who were really found this line the hardest to walk, and which surprised me.
Interesting. Eric?
Well, my answer will really much more instinctual than based on any empirical investigation, but I guess I'd make 2 points. Number one, echoing what Erica said, or sort of playing off what Erica said about those on the ground kind of getting it, I think this is largely about leadership. If the tone is set very strongly at the top, that will make a huge difference. And I think Gates' statement is an encouraging sign, but I think it needs to be obviously followed up. The real challenge, I think, will be if you try to do this in a more comprehensive way, a more systematic way, how you achieve that objective without sort of getting all gluggy in the implementation. And I think that will be the challenge.
Yeah, it would double. at just a prima facie level, it would double your operation tempo. You would have to go back into any village that you were just operating in, or if you were using air power, you'd actually have to go on the ground and go into areas where you previously didn't want to. So it would obviously would be very difficult for the military to do it. Mr. Vickers, I don't know if you wanted to make any comment from your experience. Yeah.
I would just say broadly that our military attempts to be self-policing, and that harms that we inflict on people outside of what we're trying to target, and we do pay for. The salation repayment process is something we've always done, and certainly if we, I think the tradition is more we ran over someone's tree with an armored vehicle, so we paid for it, and then the progeny of that tree. There's a detailed process for that. So certainly paying for casualties is well precedented, but I think air power plays into this in an interesting way. And I'd be interested to hear what you have to say about the proportion of casualties that come from international forces in contact versus American forces in contact. Some of our allies have very restrictive rules of engagement, which are defensive only, which sounds good in theory but executes very poorly because they cannot conduct any operations that actively separate the insurgent from the population. They give the insurgent the initiative. So they are forced to use air power because the insurgent only reveals himself out of the population at a time and place of his choosing and his advantage. Thus, they only have air power because they're always in a really bad spot. And to what extent this is sort of an operational law question and drawing up rules of engagement. I think that the American forces, their ratio of the casualties hasn't been as much, or I would suspect that it's not as much as the increase from international forces. Have you seen anything to confirm that? And is there any will on the part of European forces to address their rules of engagement and conduct more targeted operations?
I think, I'm not an expert on military tactics, and on the ground it's very difficult to tell sometimes which sortie is being flown by U.S. forces or which was called in by British forces or Afghan forces or the U.S. It's always really difficult to tell on the ground what happens with that and what the conditions are. What I've been told actually is that some of the international allies have actually more restrictive, like for example the Canadians, I think have really restrictive rules on when they can call in an airstrike in defense of their forces. I think there's an argument that the U.S. could do even more to limit when it can call in these operations. And as you point out, it's really difficult, I think, to know, like a lot of the U.S. power is supplied by the U.S. forces, U.S. Air Force, rather. So to the extent that other nations are relying on that, other nations within the alliance are relying on U.S. air power, it also puts out of our control, I think, a little bit the ability to limit this in terms of rules of engagement. So, I don't know.
One quick note that you mentioned on the compensation payments. While it's true that the U.S. has a long history of doing this, and perhaps longer than any other country, of providing compensation payments called salacia to civilians and harmed in combat operations through Grenada, Vietnam, and Korea, when the U.S. first invaded Afghanistan in 2001, the Pentagon said, no, we're not going to provide these. When we invaded Iraq, they said, no, we're not going to provide these. It's not culturally appropriate, which, as everyone knows, is not necessarily true, particularly from what you're hearing from Erica today. So in 2003, 5-6 months after the Iraq War started, Iraqis were lined up at convention centers. The commanders on the ground said, look, guys, we need some sort of funding to provide these compensation payments. At that point, with that kind of pressure from the local population, it was approved for both Iraq and Afghanistan. So it took us a little while to get around to this.
Interesting. Any question about the data question that he had around whether or not, say the UN report that was released today, do they differentiate between who's at fault, I guess, on the international military forces?
Among the international forces?
Yeah.
No, they don't. No. Okay. At least they don't release it. Perhaps they do for conjecture. I know each UN office keeps its own records of each individual incident and any available information, but the data that's released that they publicly share does not identify which one.
Okay, thanks. Gentleman in the back.
Yes, Sean Waterman from UPI. One of the ways that the US is seeking to address this issue is, Gates said, was through Afghanization of the war, so that, as he put it, it's the Afghan soldier kicking in the door, and obviously down the line it'll be the Afghan planes bombing the villages. What impact do you think that would have on the perception of the campaign among the population?
Well, I think it depends. I think there's probably two different takes on it. One is that I had a lot of civilians tell me that, you know, if, for example, if you take in the Afghan kicking in the door, that's an example of a night search, they would tell me that actually, you know, the U.S. forces that were there, they didn't notice at the time, but when they turned their backs, the Afghan forces, you know, took all the money out of my wallet and they and they hit my brother. So I think that you really do have to be careful, especially since we're still kind of mentoring and developing Afghan national security forces, that doesn't in itself open the door for more problems. I think, on the other hand, though, I've been working a lot with Afghanistan Independent Human Rights Commission, and some of what they've told me is that, yeah, they might actually commit the same abuses, or maybe they would commit more, but having an Afghan face does make a difference. You know, Afghans are more likely, and just like we talked about before, they have higher expectations of international forces, and to that extent, when an offense happens by international forces, they do take it more seriously in some ways than they do Afghans. So maybe that also answers your question. I think either way, if we do kind of open the door for more Afghanization, we need to make sure that that doesn't mean that all of the compensation and victim support programs we've talked about so far get kind of put to the side. Because right now, one of the major gaps in these compensation programs is that a lot of those that are injured or killed by Afghan forces alone are left out, or they're not necessarily recorded. And so I think that's one of the main risks that we'd be concerned about.
Eric, are we trying to assist the Afghans? I mean, you presented, and the report suggests kind of parallel programs, but you know, the question raises the question of whether we're trying to help the Afghans do this better as well, or whether the programs are existing really in parallel. We do, the internationals do their thing, the Afghans do their thing, and there's no sort of transfer of experience or capacity building.
I mean, I think both are really important. One, in terms of providing the sense of redress, both in terms of the emotional resolution of those that are victims, and also kind of these strategic hearts and minds concern. It does matter who gives it. So if they blame international forces for the harm, it matters that that's who they get the apology from. So maybe that's one answer, but at the same time, it is important that we do have better coordination. There are these Afghan government programs that in some situations can get there more quickly than international community or international forces. And also the Afghan government is going to be the one that's there, you know, 3 decades from now. So programs like the Martyrs Fund that I mentioned that give monthly payments for years to come, like, they need to be able to do a good job at that as well, and recognizing and supporting victims long after international forces are gone.
Okay, with that, I'm going to wrap up. I want to thank Sarah and Erica and Eric for their presentations. It was excellent. It seems like this issue is not going to go away. We really need to get a handle on it, and this is just really good foundational research that's essential to the work. So I want to thank you for all the hard work for making this happen, Eric for helping fund it, and thank you all for coming back to the New America Foundation, and we look forward to seeing you again.